Welcome back to Diabetic Foot Files, where we expose the hidden truths behind the surface of diabetic foot disease, challenge the assumptions that have shaped healthcare for decades. On a quick side note, congratulations to the New York Knicks. Well deserved, incredible, fantastic, loved it. So, today we're stepping away from the anatomy, wound care dressing, and the operating rooms, and instead we're going to talk about a cave, the allegory of Plato's cave. So, this is a philosophical cave. And I always loved philosophy and wanted to major, but my dad said, no, because you're going to have to work twice as hard. You're going to have to take twice as many courses because I still wanted to be pre-med. So I understood. But I love philosophy. But we're going to talk about the allegory of the cave, Plato's cave. So this philosophical cave, a cave that was described over 2,300 years ago by the Greek philosopher Plato. And if anybody knows the story about it, right? It is a very I think it mirrors a lot of what's happening with diabetes and the healthcare system and amputations. And surprisingly enough, the cave may be one of the most powerful ways for us to understand what's happening in modern diabetic foot care right now. And so today's episode is, we're going to talk about Plato's cave, diabetic foot ulcers, and the road to amputation. The story is about shadows, about the illusions, the systems that mistake the traditions for truth, and about us as healthcare professionals who've escaped the cave and discovered that many of these amputations once were considered inevitable are quite preventable actually, and thank God for the pioneers that were ahead of us, right? The people who broke down the barriers and came out of the cave and said, hey, this is what's happening. These are the things that could be preventable, things like that, but we're gonna be talking about that. So, in Plato's allegory of the cave, the prisoners are chained inside the cave from birth, and they cannot turn their heads, they cannot see behind them, so they only can see the wall. And behind them burns a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners that are chained, people carry objects that cast shadows onto the wall, and the prisoners pretty much spend their entire lives watching the shadows. And eventually, they begin to believe that the shadows are the reality, not the representations, not the distortions, but really itself. And so, imagine a diabetic foot ulcer enters the cave, and the shadows appear on the wall, and immediately everybody says the patient will lose their leg. The next ulcer appears, amputation. Another ulcer appears, amputation. Gangrene, amputation. Osteomyelitis, amputation. Charcot, they be amputation. And the cave has spoken, and the shadow has become the truth. And after decades of repetition, an entire healthcare culture begins accepting a dangerous assumption that diabetic foot ulcers equals inevitable amputation. Now, the shadows in our cave are not lies, and that's what makes them quite dangerous. They're partial truth. A diabetic foot ulcer can lead to amputation, but just as a shadow can represent a real object, but a shadow is also incomplete. A shadow lacks depth. A shadow lacks context. A shadow lacks understanding. And inside of the cave, clinicians may see a black toe, a severe infection, a non healing ulcer, exposed bone, and conclude the limb is non salvageable. I hate when people say that. But what they often don't see is what? Undiagnosed ischemia, delayed referrals, lack of vascular assessment, poor access to podiatry, inadequate offloading, lack of the multidisciplinary care, socioeconomic barriers, transportation problems, insurance issues, health literacy challenges. And the shadow says diabetes causes the amputation, but in reality, the system failed long before the surgeon arrived. So, one of the individuals who spent years helping the healthcare system escape this cave is Dr. David Armstrong. He is one of the biggest pioneers in diabetic foot ulcers and amputation prevention and limb salvage. And Dr. Armstrong has repeatedly highlighted the staggering reality that every year millions of diabetic foot ulcers occur worldwide. And majority of low extremity amputations associated with diabetes occurs approximately every 20 seconds somewhere in the world. And this statistic is been cited widely from international diabetes and diabetic foot data, and the exact timing varies somewhat depending on the data set and the year analyzed, right? But the overall message remains the same. Diabetes related limb loss is a global epidemic. But the critical question is why? Is diabetes inherently that destructive? Or is the healthcare system failing to intervene early enough? And Dr. Armstrong and many limb salvage specialists argue that diabetic foot complications should be approached like other medical emergencies. And he's famously helped popularize the concept that time is tissue, correct? And just as cardiologists say time is muscle during a heart attack, just as neurologists say time is brain during a stroke. For diabetic foot disease, time is tissue. Every hour matters, every day matters, every delay matters. Okay? Now, imagine one prisoner is released. We're still talking about the allegory of the cave. And at first, it hurts. The person's out of the cave, the light burns their eyes, and everything that person believed, that prisoner, right, who got out of the cave believed is challenged. He resists at first, eventually leaves the cave, and for the first time, he sees reality. The free prisoner represents the healthcare worker who begins asking the uncomfortable questions. You know, the podiatrist, the vascular surgeon, the wound care specialist, the endocrinologist, the nurse, the limb salvage team. They begin noticing something strange. That the patients who were scheduled for amputations are healing. The patients who are considered hopeless are walking. The patients with severe ischemia improve with revascularization and vascular intervention. Patients with osteomyelitis avoid limb loss. Patients with Charcot reconstruction can keep their limb, but the risks are still extremely high. Just keep that in mind. But the free prisoner realizes that the shadow was never the whole story. So, what exists outside the cave? So, outside the cave, the truth becomes quite visible that many of these amputations are preceded by failures in the care of delivery, right? The reality outside of the cave is that there are many delayed vascular evaluations. Many patients undergo major amputation without comprehensive vascular assessment. The limb cannot heal without blood flow, yet, too often, blood flow is evaluated late. Outside of the cave, we recognize before removing the limb, we should ask, can the circulation be restored? Now, delayed referrals. We've spoken about it. Multiple limb salvage specialists understand there is extreme problem when it comes to delayed referrals, and it needs to be fully addressed and pretty much rectified, right? Patients spend months moving in between providers, primary care, urgent care, emergency department, specialists. Meanwhile, the ulcer doesn't delay itself, okay? The ulcer worsens, infection spreads, tissue dies, and by the time they could reach a limb salvage center, options become quite limited. And the problem wasn't the ulcer, the problem was the delay. Now, one of the most effective treatments in diabetic foot care is often one of the most least utilized, and that's pressure relief. We already know offloading is a key factor when it comes to diabetic foot ulcers. And the patient continues walking, the wound continues to break down. The ulcer never receives the opportunity to heal, and the shadow says the wound is impossible. In reality, the wound never got a chance. Now, patients frequently receive care from isolated providers instead of a coordinated team. But the strongest outcomes, as they've shown, okay, and the world leaders of diabetic foot care and limb salvage have shown that strongest outcomes come from a multidisciplinary care involving podiatry, vascular, infectious disease, endocrinology, wound care, orthotics, rehabilitation, even psychiatry. Outside of the cave, we see healing as a team sport. That's what it is. Now, the greatest illusion in the cave is not that amputations occur. The greatest illusion when it comes to us, when it comes to diabetic foot ulcers, is that they're inevitable. They equate diabetic foot ulcers with inevitable amputations. And when enough people repeat the same narrative, it becomes an accepted wisdom. Just like how Michael Jackson say, The lie becomes the truth, right? So eventually, society begins saying diabetics lose their leg, almost as though it's a law of nature, like gravity or aging or death. But many of limb salvage specialists knows that this is different. There's something different. Many amputations are not a first time event. It's the final event. And the accumulation of months or even years of multiple missed opportunities, the ulcer is not the beginning. The amputation is not the beginning. The story started way earlier than this. Now, one of the hardest parts of realizing this truth is the free prisoner returns to the cave to try to enlighten the people, right? He goes back to the cave to tell the others the shadows aren't reality. Not every ulcer needs the amputation. We can restore blood flow. We can offload. We can prevent infection. We can heal. We can salvage a limb. And what happens? What Plato predicted is that the prisoners become angry because the accepted truth requires admitting that they were wrong, requiring questioning these long held on beliefs. It requires acknowledging and accountability that some of these amputations that were already done, that are irreversible, they already amputated, might have been actually avoidable. And it's an uncomfortable truth, not because anything of this is evil, right? And not because surgeons want to do amputations, but because the system developed these habits and the habit became a culture and the culture became a doctrine. And absolutely, this may become, a very important section, but it exposes the greatest illusion for us, the belief that amputation is an end of the problem. And in reality, for many of our patients, once there's an amputation, it's the beginning of an entirely new cascade of problems. Cascades like disability, medical complications, mortality. So inside the cave, the story, you know, that ends with surgery. The foot is amputated, the infection is gone, the chart is closed, the case is considered successful, right? But the prisoners watch the shadow on the wall and say the problem is solved. But outside the cave, where there are the free prisoner, right? Now, who stands in the sunlight, who sees something that others cannot see. They see that this isn't the end of the story. This is just a new chapter. This is the next chapter, another chapter that is filled with suffering, loss of independence, depression, financial hardship, cardiovascular disease, and death. And the greatest shadow in diabetic foot care is not the ulcer, it's the illusion that amputation is the cure. So when the free prisoner looks beyond the cave wall, the free prisoner realizes a shocking truth that mortality rates following a major lower extremity amputation rivals or exceeds many forms of cancer. Studies of diabetic and vascular related amputations have reportedly approximately 50 to 60% mortality by 5 years, with some cohorts reporting rates approaching to 68% among diabetic patients. So think about that. If a cancer carried a 5 year mortality of 50 to 68%, there would be major national campaigns, telethons, fundraisers, government initiatives, public awareness month. Yet, amputations often receive nowhere near the same attention, and that is so absolutely true. So, inside the cave, people often say the amputation saved the patient life. And sometimes that is absolutely true, and that is the fact. Sometimes it actually is true. Sometimes it really is true. But there are circumstances where immediate amputation is necessary. We've gone through absolute initiatives about why it would happen, why it would be life-saving, all that jazz. But there are limbs that cannot be salvaged. There are, okay? There are infections that are life-threatening. There are situations where the amputation is the correct decision. But the free prisoner asks the question, why did we get here? Could the ulcer have been detected earlier? Could the blood flow have been restored? Could the infection have been treated sooner? Could pressure have been removed? Could the patient have reached a multidisciplinary limb salvage team before catastrophe could occurred? And because, if the answer is yes, then the real failure occurred months before the operating room. Now let's talk about the economics of this. The prisoner who's outside the cave sees the amputation. No, the prisoners inside the cave. So sorry. The prisoners inside the cave sees amputation as efficient, right? They see it as quick, definitive, predictable, right? But outside the cave, the free prisoner who sees the sunlight, the actual reality of it, sees the true cost of these amputations. After major amputations, many patients experience loss of employment, reduced mobility, increased dependence, higher rates of depression, increased hospitalization, nursing home placements, recurrent admissions, contralateral limb loss, and the healthcare system often counts the operation. It doesn't count the decades of consequences afterwards. So today, the cave may look different. It may look like staffing shortages, overcrowding emergency rooms, lack of podiatry services, limited vascular access, poor reimbursement structures, fragmented healthcare networks, geographic barriers, and lack of diabetic education. And the chains are no longer iron, but the chains are systemic. And they still keep patients facing the wall, patients and clinicians. And like I said, one of the most important messages that are repeatedly emphasized by limb salvage experts such as Dr. Armstrong is that many amputations are preventable when patients receive timely intervention. Like Dr. Armstrong, has frequently highlighted the global reality that diabetes-related lower limb amputations occur approximately every 20 seconds worldwide. But hidden inside this statistic is another reality. If an amputation occurs every 20 seconds, then the true crisis isn't simply the diabetes, it's the crisis in delayed care, the crisis is fragmented care, the crisis is inadequate prevention. And it is noted that, if patients can be seen earlier, vast majority of these cases can be preventable. Now, like you said, imagine the free prisoner returning to the cave, enlightening, and the free prisoner says, many of these amputations did not have to happen. Yeah, the cave becomes quite uncomfortable because if that statement is true, like I said, the uncomfortable questions are following. How many patients never received vascular testing? How many patients never saw a podiatrist? How many patients were discharged without offloading? How many ulcers were ignored for months? How many healthcare systems lacked limb salvage programs? How many patients were lost because the system was designed to react instead of prevent? Prisoners, the people inside the cave don't want to hear this because accepting it means accepting responsibility. And for some reason, we live in this world of no accountability because it is crazy what people are suing for these days. The woman sued on the cruise ship for getting drunk. She's the one who got drunk. She's the one. That's accountability. She got drunk. Okay. They even took her back to her room and she still wanted to sue for getting drunk. Wanted to sue for getting drunk. Just like everybody has their point of view, just like the girl who got her legs amputated for jumping off of a boat. The lady says she was high on marijuana and drunk and blamed the people who gave it to her. Let me tell you something. Marijuana is not legal in that country that she lost her leg in. So I'm like, you didn't know that? And who gave it to you? Who gave you marijuana where it's illegal in the country? And then you jumped off of the boat and got your legs amputated because the propellers cut off your leg. Accountability. And this is a grown person. She just graduated college, she said. Where's the accountability? Where's the accountability? There's a huge risk of doing both of those things and then jumping off of a boat. But it seemed like nobody wants accountability. Everybody wants to be babied on top of being told that they're adults. Babied and adult. There's no what is wrong with people? Grow up. Learn accountability. People, what is wrong with people? I am very confused about what's happening today with accountability. Responsibility and accountability. Everybody's so into their ego. They do not want to accept any wrongdoing. And they don't want to be accountable and say, yes, I did this wrong. Okay? And not to blame an individual. But I'm just talking just in general with the way society is moving right now. Is lack of accountability. People aren't even people of their word anymore. Okay? The integrity of character has been completely diluted in the population lately, you know? And when it comes to diabetic foot ulcers and amputation, it's not an individual to blame. It's a system responsibility. And, systems, if it's a system, they rarely hate admitting that they're wrong. And instead of admitting that they're wrong, that's one thing my daddy taught me. Like, very wise man. I love him, love him, love him. He's passed, but very wise man. One thing he has taught me that when somebody does something wrong, they double down on it. They double down on it like a double whopper. They double down on it because these people do not nobody really wants to admit that they did something wrong, so they double down on their wrongdoing to try to make a wrong a right. And when I watch people do that, and I'm not saying that holier than thou, of course not, I've done that before too, but you learn with time and you grow and you accept and you don't make healthcare about you. Healthcare has nothing to do with ego. Healthcare is a selfless service, okay? It has nothing to do about ego. It's all about learning and increasing the quality care of our patients' lives. It has nothing to do with the person who's trying to provide the service. It's a service, okay? Yes, we all should be treated with respect, but also the patient should be treated with respect too, and should admit when we make mistakes, when we've done wrong. We should make it comfortable for a patient to be able to open up to us. We should look for every route that is available to help save the patient's limb and help them have a better quality care of life? And the real villain was never the ulcer. The real villain is not the diabetic ulcer, okay? Like I said, I've always said the diabetic ulcer is the surrender flag. The diabetes already took over long before that. The foot is very far from the brain, okay? And the heart. The diabetes started way before that. For it to get all the way down there and show itself, yeah. So the real villain is never the ulcer. The cave teaches that diabetes causes amputations. That's not true. Sunlight reveals outside the cave reveals that it's way more complicated than that. The real villain is often the chain of failures, delayed diagnosis, delayed referrals, delayed vascular intervention, lack of education, poor access to specialists, socioeconomic barrier, fragmented care delivery. The ulcer is merely where the system failed and it's a visible consequence of a failed system. Now, what's the new truth outside the cave? Outside the cave, the free prisoner understands that the shadow on the wall was never diabetic foot ulcer equals amputation. The real equation of this is that diabetic foot ulcer plus system failure equals amputation. And when the system failure continues, it becomes amputation plus cardiovascular disease plus virility plus disability equals premature death. And that is the truth hidden behind the shadows, that outside the cave, a different message emerges. A diabetic foot ulcer is not a death sentence for your limb. It's an emergency. It's a warning signal. It's a call to action. And with early detection, aggressive offloading, timely revascularization, infection control, multidisciplinary care, patient education, many limbs can be saved, many lives can be transformed, many amputations can be prevented. The shadow of inevitability of amputations disappears and the reality of everything comes into focus. And so, the shadow said you will lose your leg, right? That's what patients think of when they get a diabetic ulcer. That's the biggest fear. And the shadow said nothing can be done. And the shadow said amputation is inevitable, right? But outside the cave, in the light of limb salvage, vascular intervention, wound care, multidisciplinary care approach in medicine, prevention, we see something entirely different. We see that many amputations are not failures of biology. They are failures of the system. And when we recognize this truth, we are forced to confront the uncomfortable possibility that some of these people did not lose their limbs because of diabetes and saying that diabetes was unbeatable. Some of these people lost their limbs because the healthcare system accepted the shadow instead of searching for the light. And until we challenge those shadows, patients will continue to literally pay for this blindness, okay, with their legs, with their independence, and often too much with their lives. And I've seen it. I've seen it, unfortunately. And the mission of limb salvage is not just simply to save limbs, but it's to help the healthcare system escape that cave. And Plato Cave teaches us that the greatest obstacle to truth is not it is often not ignorance. It's certainty, okay? And for decades, healthcare has often viewed diabetic foot ulcers through this shadow cast on the cave wall: ulcer, infection, gangrene, amputation. But outside the care is a larger truth. We see prevention, we see limb salvage, we see vascular intervention, we see coordinated care, we see possibility. And perhaps the most important lesson of all is the real enemy is not always the ulcer. The real enemy may be the system that convinced us that the shadow was reality. So until next time, I hope everybody can understand why we're so passionate about this and about limb salvage and why certain of our eyes have been opened, okay? Because everyone has a story. Every limb deserves a chance. And sometimes saving a leg begins by escaping the cave. And again, congratulations to the New York Knicks. Fantastic. And this has been Diabetic Foot Files. I'm Dr. G, and take care of your feet because they take care of you.